Um, Welcome to this biology webinar, where we will be going through evolution and ecology. My name is Joe, and I have been in Lanterna now for, this is my second year. And yeah, so what I've done is basically I have taken the topic of evolution and some of ecology, and I've tried to break it down into its simplest components, and that's basically what we're going to be going through the next hour and a half. In case you're wondering about the black eye, I did not get in a fight. It occurred while playing basketball, and so yeah, that's basically why I look like that. Moral of the story is, do not play sports, just study biology. Okay? So why don't we just get started straight away? Yeah, exactly. I'm just gonna share my screen here, so that hopefully you can. So you should be able to see the screen. I'm gonna focus in on it now. So can everyone see a PowerPoint presentation now? I'm assuming that you can hear and see me since you're responding. Yes, no? Okay, awesome. And I should be like a little icon on the side. Yeah, I'm just going to assume that's the case. Okay, cool. So why don't we first give a little overview as to what we're going to be discussing. And maybe I'll make this page a little bit bigger. Oh, and by the way, if you have any questions of any kind, you can always just write it into the chat. I'll be checking back into it periodically. And yeah, and just basically checking if you have any questions or anything like that. Okay. Okay, so this is what we're going to be going through in the next hour or so. We're going to be going through all of evolution, talk about the evidence for it, natural selection, what that is, biodiversity, cladistics. We're going to go into ecology, but ecology, we're not going to go through all of it. We're just going to focus on energy flow and climate change, just to try and keep it concise and talk about the most relevant things. And yeah, hopefully by the end of it, you will feel a little bit more confident about these two topics, which typically get overlooked in class because they're relatively minor, but it is important. They do have some important components which are noteworthy. So yeah, hang in there. Okay, so what is evolution? Evolution is when the heritable characteristics of a species change over time. Yeah, and that statement might not make sense to you right now. But hopefully it will in just a bit. And the person that I've sprinkled around the star here is Charles Darwin, who is basically like the father of evolution, as you might know. Okay, but so we're going to take a look at what these different things mean in just a second. First, let's talk about what the evidence for evolution is. So as we know, evolution is when a species changes, or when the characteristics of a species change over time. How did Charles Darwin know that evolution was a thing? What evidence is there in the world? Well, there's two components to the IB that the IB want you to know that serve as evidence for evolution. The first of these is the fossil record. And what that means is that if you dig into the earth, you will see that you can kind of see like this chronology of time according to the bones that are found in there. So basically the oldest bones, or the oldest soil is found deepest in the ground, and newest soil is found closest to the surface. And by looking at the different bones that you find in different ages, you can basically see how different structures of a species progresses over time, right? So that serves as a powerful evidence for evolution, because, for example, you're never going to find a very complex structure that you might find in a modern day horse buried together with the structures or the bones that you find for the pre-ancestrous horse, right, in much deeper layers. Okay, so there's a chronology in terms of the fossil record. And also, we as humans can perform selective breeding whenever we want. So if we are growing certain types of plants that we want to look in a certain type of way, we will breed together those with favorable characteristics. And over time, we can basically produce species that are completely different to the parent, just because we have constantly selected for these favorable characteristics. And we can see this in the example here using plants, or like broccoli, which all stem from this plant that they have in common. You could also see it in the dogs that we breed, right? We breed together the dogs that aren't violent, that don't bite people, that look nice and cute and things like that, which means that we basically change the characteristics of a species over time. Okay, so two pieces of evidence for evolution. We also have an example of evolution, which the IB loves to throw in there, which is the pendactyl limb. I can make the presentation full screen. Sometimes there's a problem with it. Wait, that wasn't full screen. That was just... I'm going to make it full screen now. And I'm hoping that you can see it. Sometimes it doesn't always carry across properly. Okay, some examples of evolution. The pendactyl limb. A pendactyl limb is a limb that a lot of species today have in common from a common ancestor. The reason why it's called a pendactyl limb is because pen is kind of like the root for 5. And it's based on a limb that has these 5 digits here, and then this common structure above it. Okay. Now, the pendactyl limb serves as evidence for evolution, or serves as an example of evolution, specifically adaptive radiation. Now, what does adaptive radiation mean? It means that if you have one common ancestor, right? So if you have a species that had a limb that was very basic, that had 5 digits and then these 2 bones that stick up on top of it, if you expose this species to different environments, then that limb will adapt. So, for example, if you put the species or this member of a species into an environment where it is favorable to fly, over time, the pendactyl limb developed into a wing, for example, which this is a bat wing, as far as I'm concerned. Okay. Whereas if you put the same pendactyl limb in an aquatic environment where it is favorable to swim, well, then the pendactyl limb adapts to become something that looks more like a fin, right? Or it can develop into the hoof of a horse, right? So the same characteristic exposed to different environments will produce different functions eventually. And this is what we call adaptive radiation, okay? There's another example of evolution that you need to know in 5.1, which is melanistic insects and the polluted areas. So what does that mean? Basically, tree bark, sorry, not tree bark, the lichens that you find on tree are highly responsive to the pollution that we find in the atmosphere, okay? And there are these specific moths that live on this lichen, okay? Now, in the 18th century, all moths used to be this very white color. Why? Well, because their environment, so where they lived, was on this white lichen. Because when lichen is in a non-polluted area, it is white, okay? It doesn't pick up all this nasty carbon stuff, right? And so these lichens were well protected. They were very well camouflaged in this white environment. However, what happened is that in the 19th century, we had this industrial evolution where all of a sudden we developed these machines that emitted a lot of CO2 and all this kind of gunk into the air. And what happens, the lichen turned from white color into a darker color, right? What does this mean for the white moths that existed at the time? Well, whereas previously these white moths were very well camouflaged. So, for example, you can see that with this red ring down here, you can't even see the moth. Now, all of a sudden, they're completely exposed on this much darker, on these much darker trees, which meant that they were much more likely to get eaten by birds or whatever feeds on them. Okay, which now meant that this peppered moth, so a darker variant of the same species, was favored. And so over time, the general population of the moth turned from this very white color into this more peppered color. Okay. And we call this melanism because melanin refers to the color of the surface of the insects, okay? So basically, pollution provided a survival advantage to the darker moths, and hence we have this change in the species. I'm just going to check back and see that everyone can see my presentation okay and that there aren't any questions. Okay. So does that mean that you've only just been able to see what I've done? Oh, that's not good. Okay, sorry, I should probably have checked back earlier. Hold on a second, how am I going to do this? How about if I just make the screen a little bit bigger, like that? Can you then see it okay? Okay. Okay, cool. Then we'll just go with that. Okay. But okay, basically what I said was hopefully an explanation enough. This peppered moth developed into changed color because of the environment, which turned its environment into a darker color. Hence, the species were converted to a darker color as well. Okay, cool. So that's 5.1. It basically just talks about the nature of evolution and how it's when the heritable characteristics, right, the characteristics like the color of an insect, change over time in one specific species. Okay, and it gives you all these different examples and the evidence of it. Not too confusing. 5.2 talks about the mechanisms that drive, or the single mechanism that drives evolution. Okay, and this mechanism or this phenomenon is something known as natural selection, which you will definitely have heard about before. Okay, and importantly, natural selection can only occur if there's a variation among the species, right? And so a species, it kind of makes sense, right? That if you want to be able to select for different characteristics in a species, well, then it doesn't help that every single member of a given species looks identical to everyone else, right? We have to have some kind of a variation so that we can select for different, well, variations, right? But so how do we create this variability between species? The IB mentions 3 specific types of ways that variations are caused. Firstly, it's mutations, right? So when we change the genetic code that sets up for a species. So we have to actually change the base pair sequence so that the species will somehow change its phenotype, right? Meiosis is then very important for mixing these different variations together. And obviously we can't go into meiosis today, but there are some different mechanisms in there. And then sexual reproduction. So this idea that we can take any individual and mix it together with any other potential individual and then create offspring that is different from both the parents, right? So that's variation. And variation is absolutely essential for natural selection to work, okay? What natural selection does is that it creates adaptations in an environment. What does this mean? It means that it purposefully selects for specific variations which are favorable in a given environment. It selects for variations in characteristics which are given a survival advantage. Okay, that's what natural selection is, and it's a completely natural process. So why does natural selection happen? Well, it's primarily based on the idea that species make too much offspring, right? So not everyone can survive in any environment, which is really important because if everyone were able to survive, well, then there'd be no pressure. There'd be no reason for a species to change over time because, well, everybody's the same, right? Everybody has an equal chance of surviving, so why should person A become more favorable in one environment than in the other, okay? And so if we kind of zoom into this process, what does this mean? Well, consider that you have 2 animals, right? Animal 1 and animal 2. If animal 1 survives a given environment, it is more likely to pass on its characteristics, right? It's more likely to create offspring with another individual that's survived, okay? If an animal doesn't survive, so for example, if animal 2 doesn't survive, it is less likely to pass on the characteristics. Super simple, right? What this means is that over time, more animals, sorry, I shouldn't say people, I should say animals, more animals will have the characteristics of animal 1, right? Because it's just more likely to produce offspring than animal 2, okay? But this is quite important because sometimes people confuse this idea that an individual somehow changes over a lifetime to become adapted to an environment. Evolution doesn't occur in one generation. It occurs over many, many, many generations by constantly selecting for one specific feature. Okay? Does that make sense to everyone? Or is there anything that's not clear? Awesome, super. Then I'll just keep moving on. Okay. So one application of natural selection is the finches of the Daphne major, right? So there's a specific island in the Galapagos. And the reason why they are used as kind of an example of natural selection is because you can see a variation in the species in very short time periods. So whereas evolution normally occurs over millions of years, meaning that we can't really see the start and the end of the process, with the finches on Daphne major, you could actually see evolution occurring over a couple of decades, which was amazing. And this is also why these are called Darwin's finches. So these are the ones that Charles Darwin was quite happy with. Okay. Now, why are they an evidence of evolution? Basically, on this island, different years introduced different conditions. So they had what's called the wet season and then what's called the dry season. And these dry seasons occurred in 3 different periods when Darwin was studying these finches. They occurred in 1977, 1980, and 1982. Okay. Now, what happened in these different years when there was these dry seasons is that it was observed that the beak size, the average size of the beaks of these finches, so these birds here, would grow in the years, right? So just because the weather was dry, all of a sudden the beaks became larger in the population over time, which was quite weird, except for when you consider the feeding mechanism of these finches, because these finches fed on specific seeds. And when the environment was dry, these seeds became much larger, meaning that it was more favorable to have a larger beak since it could break larger seeds, right? And so you immediately had this process of natural selection that every time a dry season came around, the seeds became larger. So you needed larger beaks, meaning that the finches with the larger beaks were more likely to survive, and hence they increased in their proportion of the population. Okay, once the dry season went away and the season became wetter again, well, then all of a sudden the seeds became smaller. And so now it is more favorable to have smaller seeds, which is why you had this drop in the beak sizes after each dry season. Okay, so this is actually quite interesting that we could see evolution occurring within just a couple of decades. I find that pretty cool, at least. Another application of natural selection involves antibiotic resistance in bacteria. So this diagram here is quite useful to explain that. Basically, if you imagine a body that has a specific variation of bacteria in it, and let's just say that they're all causing illness, right? And then you take antibiotics. Antibiotics are really good at killing off most of these bacteria, right? So it'll kill off like 99.9, right? But a certain percentage of these bacteria that you have, which are causing an illness, are resistant to the antibiotic. So they don't actually get killed by the antibiotic. What does that mean? Well, that means that in the next generation, so if you were to look at this person after they've taken antibiotics, so like a year later, or not, it doesn't even have to be that long, a week later, well, then all these bacteria that weren't killed off all of a sudden become the mainstream bacteria that you find in the population of the same person, right? And so now there's a general increase in resistance against these bacteria, against these antibiotics, meaning that if you were to give the same antibiotics again, then you have a much harder time at killing off the bacteria. Now, this is a problem that clinicians and doctors are constantly dealing with, because sometimes you have this breakout of these superbugs that are resistant to all antibiotics that are known to man. For example, the MRSA bacterium that created quite a few problems a couple of years ago. Oh, it still is. And so, yeah, that's not very good. And so if there's any tip, always complete your round of antibiotics, because that greatly increases your chance of killing off all bacteria that are causing illness. Okay, so now you know that. Nice. So that was all of 5.2. Talked about natural selection, the mechanism by which it works, and then 2 simple applications of it. And hopefully that's all pretty clear to everyone. The 5.3 talks about the classification of biodiversity. Now, this topic is one where it's quite easy to forget quite a lot of detail. And you'll see what I mean in just a second. So just hang in with me here for a second. 5.3 starts off about talking about the binomial system, which is basically just a system that we use to name organisms. Okay, so for example, it's basically the generic way to write it is that we write the genus name and then the species name in this chronological order. Okay, and you always write it in italics, and the first letter of the first word is capitalized, but the first letter of the second word is not capitalized. Okay, so an example that all of you will know is the Homo sapiens, right? So that's us. And it's just a way to name organisms. So what does this mean? What is a genus and what is specifically a species? What are they talking about here? Well, to understand that, we have to look at the way that we actually classify organisms using taxonomy. Basically, all living organisms are categorized and subcategorized and subcategorized and subcategorized again and again and again and again until you reach basically the most specific type of classification that we have, which is what we call a species. Okay? And as you'll know from topic 4, no, so Homo sapiens, the sapiens should not be capitalized. Did I capitalize it there? Oh, sorry. My bad. Good, well spotted. As we know from topic 4, is a group of organisms that can interbreed with each other to produce fertile offspring. Okay, and that is the most specific that we can get when classifying an organism. But the more broader categories of species is what we call a genus. So loads of different species which come from the same ancestral path is called a genus, and then we can categorize genuses into families, and then orders and classes and phylum and kingdoms, and then domains. Okay, so a domain is basically our most general way, or our largest grouping of different organisms. And the IB specifically wants you to know about three specific types of domains that you can be in. You can either be an archaean, or bacteria, or eukaryote. So all organisms on the planet are either going to be classified as one of these three different domains. Okay, and you have to be able to replicate those. So how do we decide which organisms go into which family and into which order and into which class? Well, we use ancestral evolution. So the way this is supposed to be organized is that all members of the same species, all members of a species which come from the same genus have evolved along that path. Okay, so all members of the same species share a common ancestor, and all members of the same genus share a same ancestor. And all members of the same family share a common ancestor, and same with the order and the class and the phylum. Okay, so it's basically a way of categorizing according to evolution. And we call this process of categorization taxonomy, and hence the people who actually classify organisms are going to be called taxonomists. Okay, and as we're going to talk about later, we sometimes reclassify taxonomy based on new evidence, but we're going to talk about that. Okay. Sadly, you have to, for the IB, be able to give a complete classifications of 2 organisms, one animal and one plant eukaryote. Now, you can choose any organisms that you want. I've given the example of the blue whale and the garlic here. And yeah, you basically just have to be able to recite what each domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species of these 2 organisms are. Okay? And one way to remember the order in which these different groups go, so how do we go from most generic to most specific, is with the acronym Dear King, or not acronym, the mnemonic Dear King Philip, come over for good spaghetti. Okay? And if you remember that, then you'll remember what each of the subcategorizations are. Okay? Do they ever ask questions about that? So this was introduced in the 2016 syllabus, as far as I'm aware. I haven't seen one in any of the papers since then, but anything on this syllabus is a go, right? So, I mean, I think this is one of those things that you would want to just memorize the day before the exam. It's simply just short-term memory that you just want to be able to blurt out again. But I wouldn't worry too much. Yeah, so that is basically what, so they could say give a full classification, a taxonomic classification of an animal, of a eukaryote from the animal kingdom. That's what they could say. No, they couldn't name the no, that'd be crazy if they could tell you which animal to say. No, you get to choose. Exactly. No, so they specifically mentioned in the syllabus that it has to be eukaryotes, either from the animal or the plant kingdom. Okay, so if you learn blue whale and garlic, you're set. You don't have to know anything further than that. Okay, but if we're just gonna move on for a second, this next part of the syllabus is one that I particularly wasn't too fond of. It is that you have to be able to recognize the different subcategories of plant phyla, animal phyla, and vertebrae. Okay, so each of these phyla, and a phyla is just one of these categorizations, where it is right here, right? Has different classes within it. And within the plant phylum, we have the bryophytes, the Conoferophyta, the Felicinophyta, and the Angiospermophyta. I probably pronounced those incorrectly. But each of these different classes have specific characteristics which are specific to them. And you have to be able to memorize these and then be able to reproduce them, or be able to recognize an organism and tell which class it is coming from. Okay, and that wasn't very good English. So yeah, this is sadly something that you basically just have to brute memorize. There's not that much that I can go through here. It's just wish you good luck. Okay. Yeah, so have a look at that later. The final part of 5.3 is the ability to use dichotomous keys. And a dichotomous key is basically just a set of questions that we can use to work out what an organism is, right? So for example, if we look at this diagram here, yeah, I can send you all this PowerPoint later. If I'll put in my email, and then if you send me an email, I'll send you back an email with the presentation. How about that? Okay, so we're gonna basically, we start off with a large group of organisms, and we somehow have to classify these organisms into different systems. And then we could ask the question, well, from these organisms, are there wings present? And if we say yes, well, then we go down this category of questions over here. And if we say no, then we're going to go down this category of questions over here. So for example, if the wings are present, is there 2 pairs of wings or just 1 pair of wing? And then immediately, if the answer to if the answer is just 1 pair of wings, then we know that it must be a fly in our dichotomous key. Hopefully that makes sense. So it's just a series of questions that we can use to decipher the differences between different organisms. And maybe you can practice later at distinguishing how a human could be distinguished from a monkey or something like that, right? So hopefully that makes sense. 5.4 talks about cladistics. And basically what cladistics is a way to organize or classify organisms specifically based on their ancestors, okay? So whereas previously people have organized organisms into maybe what they look like or what they have as similar, cladistics specifically focus on the ancestral evolution of a species, okay? And what you see here is a cladogram, as we're going to go into. Okay, but so what exactly is a clade, right? This is just going to be a group of organisms that have the same ancestral path. So they have somehow originated from the same species at some point in time. So for example, we could take this basking shark and the common southern stingray, and at some point in time, they will have had a common ancestor, which means that they form part of the same clade. Now, if you go back far enough, then eventually you could determine that everything is part of the same clade, but you have to be relatively specific and try and keep it focused within a certain amount of organisms, okay? You also have to know about different types of traits that organisms can have. So structures can either be homologous or they can be analogous. Now, what is the difference between these two? A homologous structure is something which came from the same organism, but then via adaptive radiation, so what we talked about earlier with the pendactyl limb, the organism now will serve different functions. So this is a homologous structure is something that looks very different, right? So for example, the fin of a shark and the wing of a bat, but they originate from the same ancestors. Hence, they're called homologous. And the pendactyl limb is the best example of that, all right? Then we have analogous structures. Now, these are structures which look the same, but which only look the same because different ancestors have been exposed to the same environment, all right? So for example, orcas and different types of sharks, well, their fins will, you would guess, have come from the same ancestors in the past, whereas in reality, the reason why the shark and the orca have very similar looking fins is because of convergent evolution, meaning that you took different species, put them in the same environment, and selected for the same favorable traits, and over time, the species began to look the same, but they come from different ancestral paths, okay? So that's a clear distinction. Sometimes people get confused with that. So hopefully that makes sense. All right. If we just go back to clades for a second, how do we actually work out which species came from which ancestors, right? Because we can't roll back time and see at which point in time a prokaryote or a specific bacteria developed into two different bacteria, right? We can't just roll back time. But what we can do is that we can look at base sequences. So we can look at organisms' DNA. And the logic follows that because mutations are introduced over time, right? So if we can change something's DNA over time, well, then the longer an organism or a specific organism is on the planet, well, the longer it will be exposed to mutations. So the logic holds that over time, we introduce more and more mutations, so our DNA becomes more and more different. And hence, that way we can compare two different organisms, which we think come from the same ancestor. And in order to work out, well, which one developed first, we just have to see, well, which one has the most similar DNA structure to that common ancestor, right? Because if one set of DNA is more common than the other one, well, then that one must have come along first, right? That hopefully makes sense. So yeah, we basically look at DNA sequences. We can also look at base sequences since DNA codes for base sequences. But DNA is favorable, typically, okay? And so what we produce through cladistics is what's called a cladogram. And what this is basically a diagram which depicts when we believe different organisms split from each other on an evolutionary path with regards to time, okay? So if we look at the primates of today, which also includes us down here at the bottom, then we all had some ancestral primate in common around 60 million years ago, okay? But as this ancestor lived on planet Earth, well, it occurred a couple of mutations. There was a change in the heritable characteristics over time, which meant that different types of primates started evolving off of this original ancestor, okay? And the most recent development on this diagram is going to be the humans, right? So these were the ones that developed most recently on this timeline, okay? Now, if I were to ask who is the closest or what species is the closest relative to the humans, then what would the answer be to that based on this diagram here? So that is a question to the audience. Oh yeah, of course. So it's a So basically the question was, who is the closest relative to the humans? Let me actually just zoom into this diagram here. Let you guys have a go. Yeah, exactly. So because we can see on this timeline that it was only, let's say, around 8 million years ago that the chimpanzees and the humans distanced from each other or separated from each other on an evolutionary path, then that must be the closest relative, right? Simultaneously, you could say that the lemurs are the most the most distant relative. Okay. And so let me just see if I can make this fully readable again. There we go. Let's keep it PC here. All right, so the final part of evolution before we go into ecology is just an application of this is an application of this principle of cladistics, right? So why is cladistics important? Why does anyone care about it? Well, basically, we are only recently have been able to actually use cladistics, right? Because it wasn't so long ago that we were first able to sequence a genome on humans, let alone on any animals, right? And so since we've been able to analyze species DNAs, and we've been able to track these changes in the DNA over time, well, that has allowed for us to actually reclassify the way that we think about ancestral evolutions over time, okay? So the figworts family is one example of this. where it used to be one of the largest families in the plant kingdom. I think it was the 8th largest family at one point. But the problem was that they had loads of different species which didn't, like, they all looked similar, but they somehow didn't belong to the same categories. And so what scientists did is that they had a look at the DNA of these different figwort families, and they subcategorized these figworts, the figwort family, into loads of different subcategories based on the evolutionary path. Okay, so they had a look at the genetic material of the chloroplast, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, exactly, the chloroplast gene. And they found that certain changes in the chloroplast gene occurred at specific times, which meant that there was different categories of figworts, which now meant that you can make the figwort families a little bit smaller. Okay, so you basically subcategorize one family into different families using cladistics. Okay, and that's because cladistics are more accurate than simply basing ancestral evolution on the same appearances of organisms. Okay, so that is it for evolution. I don't know if you guys have any more questions before we go on from here, or if anything wasn't clear. I'll take the silence as a no. Okay, so topic 4, we're not going to go through all of ecology, simply because that wasn't the plan here. So we're just going to focus on 4.2 and 4.4, which is also typically the parts that people have most trouble with. So 4.2 talks about energy flow. So basically, how does energy flow in a system around how does energy flow in an ecosystem? Now, to understand energy flow, we first have to understand, well, where does energy come from, which enters our ecosystem? And the answer to that is that the sun provides all of the energy for an ecosystem. Okay, there's no other source of energy that can enter into an ecosystem as far as the IB is concerned. Okay, now this light energy from the sun is then converted by producers, so anything that can undergo photosynthesis, so that can provide energy for itself, and it converts this light energy into chemical energy. Okay, this chemical energy can then be passed on to 2 different things. Either it can be passed on to the consumer via feeding, or it can be passed along to decomposers by the producer dying. Okay, we're not really going to focus on that right now. Okay, so the important key syllabus point is that chemical energy is passed along the food chain via feeding. Okay, and this is a way that we can pass energy on from one organism to the next. But not all energy is passed from one organism to the next, because some energy is used to do respiration, right? So the process of actually letting ourselves survive. Now, when we undergo respiration, so when we produce the ATP necessary for survival, what happens is that we actually lose energy to the environment. And this is specifically in the form of heat. Okay? And so that's not good. And it's not ideal for in terms of efficiency. Okay? But the rest of the energy either passes on via feeding, or it passes on to decomposers via death or anything like that. Okay? If we just look at a schematic representation of energy flow, we can use these pyramids of energy, which you have to be able to recognize, but not and replicate actually for the IB. And what they are is basically these cubes that you stack on top of each other to represent how much energy is in the different levels in a food chain. Okay? And obviously, the first level of any food chain is going to be the producers, right? Because that's where all energy first enters into the system. Okay? And so this is what we call the first trophic level, so the first part of feeding. Now here you can assume that there is 100% of all energy. Now, sadly, or not sadly, but what we observe is that when we pass energy from one trophic level to the next, we have a very low efficiency. So we have roughly 10% efficiency between trophic levels. Now, there are different reasons why we don't pass on all energy. Firstly, we already mentioned, all organisms have to respire. right? So they have to actually use that chemical energy that they've eaten to drive their cells. And in the process, we produce heat energy, and this heat energy is lost to the environment. You can never recover it back into the food chain. Okay. Some other reasons that we can lose energies between trophic levels is that maybe we don't eat all parts of an organism, right? So, for example, when a lion kills a gazelle or something like that, it's not going to eat all the bones or anything like that. And so, obviously, because the bones have a certain amount of energy, that means that energy is lost. Okay. Now, luckily, bones can be decomposed by things like detritivores and things like that. But obviously, that doesn't pass on to the immediate organism that's feeding on it, to the lions. Another way that we can lose energy between trophic levels is via the ingestion of waste products. So what does that mean? That means that some things that we eat aren't actually absorbed into the body. They simply just pass right through. And hence, the energy that is found in this food is then not going to be used, right? So that's considered lost energy, okay? So what you have to be able to do is you have to be able to create these boxes that represent energy and then illustrate that the efficiency between trophic levels is not perfect. It's roughly a 10% efficiency, okay? And very, very, very important, I'm just going to stress this one more time, is that when we do respiration, we lose energy to the environment in the form of heat, okay? In the exam, like in the GCSE, do we need to make an own classification diagram? So Moon, are you referring back to evolution now? I'm assuming you are. So do we need to make an own classification diagram? So you don't have to be able to make a cladistics diagram, or sorry, a cladogram, if that's what you're asking. You just have to be able to create a dichotomous key. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you have to be able to create a dichotomous key. So a set of questions. Wait, let me just go back. You have to be able to create a set of questions to distinguish between two different set of organisms. Okay. Now, what I think that the IB would want to do is that they will, if they're going to ask a question like that, they're going to use these different characteristics of the different phyla and ask you to distinguish between bryophytes, coniferophytes, felicinophytes, and angiospermophytes using a dichotomous key. Or at least that's what I could imagine. I don't know that, but that would just be a guess. Okay. But so yeah, energy flow between trophic levels isn't perfect since heat energy can't be recycled and we don't consume all parts of an organism. Okay. The final thing that we're going to be talking about today is climate change. So obviously a very important topic in today's day and age. Specifically the greenhouse effect. So the greenhouse effect, I'm sure you've heard about loads and loads and loads and loads and loads. But if you need a reminder, it is basically the process where the Earth is heating up in the same way that a greenhouse can heat up when the sun is shining. Okay. And the way that it works is that sunlight passes its rays of light in the form of short wavelength radiation onto the Earth. Okay. Now, this short wavelength radiation is going to be absorbed by the Earth, right? So it's going to be used to heat the Earth for a short period of time. But then this radiation doesn't just stay within the Earth's core; is actually re-emitted from the surface of the Earth in the form of long wavelength radiation, also known as infrared radiation or heat energy. Okay. Now, most of this infrared radiation is going to escape into the atmosphere. Okay, but a certain proportion of it is going to collide with these specific particles which we have in our atmosphere. Now, ideally, I would want to draw something now, but I won't be able to do that without going full screen. So I'm not going to be able to do that. So I'm going to draw it with my hands. So basically, imagine that there are these different particles that are found in the atmosphere. And as this long wavelength radiation collides with these particles, the particles are able to absorb the energy, right, and hence become warmer for a short period of time. But not only do they do that, they also re-emit this long wavelength radiation in all directions. So kind of like a cluster grenade, if any of you know what that is. So you hit one, and then that energy, so that radiation that has collided with this specific particle, gets re-emitted, which then allows for some of that heat, which would have escaped into outer space, then goes back down to the Earth, and hence it heats up the Earth again. And then you have this repeated process where basically the long wavelength radiation can't actually escape from the atmosphere, meaning that you have this constant heating process, right? Now, why is this relevant to us? Well, what we have been able to do as a species over the last 120 years is that we've been able to introduce a huge amount of these particles that can absorb infrared radiation. These particles are called greenhouse gases. The two most common greenhouse gases are water and CO2. So CO2, the thing that we produce when our cars exhaust, and water, which we also produce in exhaust processes and all these different types of things. Okay. Now, because we have been increasing the concentration of these greenhouse gases so significantly, it has meant that we have been trapping more and more of this long wavelength radiation inside of our atmosphere, meaning the planet has slowly been heating up over time. And so what that has led to is that we've had these global increases in temperature. And this is from an experiment in an observatory somewhere in Hawaii, which was the first people that actually showed the impact of CO2 on the global temperature change. So what you can see here is that there's really nice matching of CO2 levels in the air, right, as you can see on the y-axis here, and the temperature of the Earth, right? So obviously that's a problem. And I'm not going to go into any more detail than that because I'm sure you've heard about it plenty of times. The IB wants you to specifically know that because we've had this increase in global temperatures, there has been a significant harm to the ecosystems around the world, specifically things like the coral reefs. So the Great Barrier Reef of Australia has been claimed it has had irreversible damage, is what experts say now, meaning that we're basically going to be losing this natural phenomenon of extreme beauty, which is, of course, a terrible shame, because of this introduction of all these greenhouse gases, right? No, it hasn't officially died, but they basically confirmed that it's not going to be able to return to the state that it was in at specific health, at top health, okay? But so what you have to be able to do is that you have to describe how the greenhouse effect works using words like long wavelength radiation and short wavelength radiation, and then the different greenhouse gases, okay? And you have to be able to list the different greenhouse gases that exist and know that water and CO2 are the most dominant ones, so they're the ones that are most important in heating the Earth, and then methane and nitrous oxides are they still have an impact, but it's a less significant impact. Okay, but that is basically it in terms of what I had to say about evolution and ecology. Okay, so I hope that made sense to you all. If you send me an email, then I will send you back a copy of this presentation if that is something that you're interested in. And yeah, otherwise, are there any more questions? I do not have any PowerPoint questions, any questions to go through. That would probably have been a good idea. I'll see if I can send you some. If you send me an email, then I can send you a couple of past paper questions that would have matched. Okay, but I don't have any for this presentation here. Yeah, exactly. So ecology and evolution, well, these specific parts that we've picked out are quite small topics, and so that's why we can go through it quite quickly. Okay, so there's not too much explanation to do with it. Okay, do you guys have any questions? Yes, I can send you. So if you send me an email, I'll send you the presentation and some database questions. But I won't be able to send you any marking, sadly. Yeah, so the thing about evolution and ecology is that conceptually they're very simple. So there's not. So whereas all the other topics have like these very long processes, right? So like how a synapse works is kind of hard to get your head around. Whereas evolution and ecology are just lots of pieces of very simple information. So it's quite easy to remember a lot of it. Yeah, it would definitely be a steal. So yeah, do try and really focus on those parts of the syllabus, because people typically don't, because they focus on some of the harder parts. But it's a shame if you get a question about the carbon cycle or energy cycling or anything like that to then miss out on points. So I would definitely try and focus on that. I personally don't know about tipping point, so I don't think that they expect us to know about that. Yeah, exactly. All right, cool. So if there are no more questions, then I will let you guys enjoy your Thursday evening. You can always send me questions about anything to do with ecology evolution or anything in general in the syllabus. And yeah, so if you just send me an email, then I will send you this presentation. Okay. Best of luck with the exams and see you guys soon. Bye-bye.